shadow on the roadside. The northeast part of the city had long been considered a dead zone. The houses there seemed to have been abandoned in the middle of life, forgotten and neglected. The asphalt whispered under the wheels, cracks reflecting the rain like cuts on an old man's skin. The night stretched out like a sticky web, and in this stickiness, a patrol car with the call sign 84-19 slowly crept through the neighborhood. It was the Black Route, street slang for a neighborhood where people were stopped for no reason at night. Doors weren't opened during the day, and surveillance cameras had long since stopped working, not because they were broken, but because of indifference. There were two people inside the car: Officer Randall McClansky, a man in his 50s with a heavy face carved from stone, and John Jenkins, his young partner, not yet burned by experience but already imbued with the unspoken code of the streets. Dark skin is a potential threat. Not officially, not written in the rules, just on a subconscious level, like a mosquito bite in childhood that you can now always predict. They noticed a figure on the other side of the street. A tall man in a black hooded jacket was walking slowly and steadily along the sidewalk. His gait did not express alarm, and he was not running. He was not trying to hide. On the contrary, he walked as if he had no one to fear. This was what first irritated the officers: calmness. At 2 a.m, in this neighborhood. The car swerved sharply to the side of the road. The headlights illuminated the man. He turned around. His face was barely visible in the light. Dark skin, a beard, the shadow of his hood. No fear, no surprise, just a calm, heavy gaze, like water that no one dares to jump into. The officers got out almost simultaneously, placing their hands on their holsters with practiced movements. A threat? Not yet, but they had to act. Detain him, check him out. That was the order in their heads. The color of his skin, the neighborhood, and the late hour all automatically made him a priority threat. The man stopped, not taking a step back. He didn't raise his hands or show any aggression. He didn't even try to explain anything, because he knew there was no need. He had already been arrested, not formally, internally. In the minds of the officers, he was guilty by virtue of his presence. He was forced to stand by the hood of the car. The search was thorough, deliberately harsh, with pressure and jerks. There was nothing in his pockets: no phone, no keys, no wallet. Only a leather bracelet with an engraving that did not resemble any language he knew. It was dry, despite the rain, and this dryness seemed to anger McClansky even more. No reason for detention was given, just a check which, like thousands of others, turned into humiliation. The young officer tried to copy the behavior of his superior, increasing the pressure. His hands were clamped in handcuffs, too tight. The man did not protest. His body was relaxed, as if he had been through this before, as if this scenario was not new but only repetitive. When they put him in the car, McClansky sat down heavily behind the wheel without saying a word. He felt a strange inner tension, not from the detainee, but from himself. Everything was too clean, too calm, as if he himself had set a trap into which he was now slowly stepping. The drive to the station was short. The car was silent. None of the officers spoke. Neither did the detainee. Only raindrops drummed on the roof, like a timer counting down to something unpleasant. There was no movement at the entrance to the station. An old woman dispatcher was dozing in front of the surveillance screen. McClansky led the detainee into the room. There were no documents. His name was unknown. The database was empty. The system requested a date of birth. McClansky entered a default date, January 1st, 1990, standard for the nameless. The screen flashed. A red window popped up. Restricted access. Access level 5. Unauthorized entry is not possible. For a moment, both officers froze. The system had never requested such permissions for ordinary detainees. This was a level higher, far higher than their authority, perhaps even higher than the city administration. Jenkins tried to refresh the data. The result was the same. The databases were not accepting the information. The man did not exist. No biometrics, no fingerprints, no iris scan results. It was as if the system refused to recognize him as a person. Inside the cell, the detainee sat quietly. He didn't ask any questions or demand a lawyer. He just stared. Sometimes he closed his eyes. He breathed evenly. It was as if he was waiting for it all to end, not by their decision, but by someone else's. McClansky paced the corridor, cursing himself for getting involved in this mess. Only one thought ran through his head. Why did I do this? He couldn't answer. Everything seemed right, according to the instructions, and at the same time, deeply wrong. He felt as if he had not just made a mistake, but opened a door he should not have touched. Not that day, not that face. The morning at the station began with an uneasy silence. There were no usual roll calls, no noise from the coffee machine, no banal exchanges of jokes between shifts. The night seemed to have left behind an invisible film, thick and sticky. It was invisible to the eye, but everyone who crossed the threshold felt that something in the air had changed. The detainee was still in the isolation cell. He didn't ask for water, didn't ask what time it was, didn't knock on the door. The surveillance camera recorded his silence. He sat on the bench, sometimes closing his eyes as if in a meditative state. He showed no signs of panic or irritation. This calmness seemed abnormal, wrong. Officer Jenkins, returning from a short nap in the break room, was the first to notice that something was wrong with the report. His attempt to print the arrest data produced a blank document. No name, no reason, no date, as if the file had been created but not filled in. He opened a saved copy and saw only the date, empty. The system had crashed. After rebooting twice, it displayed a warning on a red background. Access denied, ID mismatch, object blocked. McClansky entered with a heavy face, holding a wet cigarette in his hands. Not smoked, not discarded. He hadn't slept. He knew that the matter had gone beyond bureaucracy. He had seen people like this before. Not similar, but not like this. This man was not afraid. He was not defensive. He was waiting. He doesn't have an ID, McClansky thought, but he acts like he owns the place, like he knows all of us, like we're the ones in the cell. While the officers rushed between screens, the internal network, and attempts to connect to the central database, the captain's assistant entered the building. He was holding an internal memo. Urgent security check after an unidentified incident in the management archive. No one explained what the incident was, but the document's headline said the same thing as Jenkins's computer screen: ID mismatch. At the same time, in the hallway near the camera, the officer on duty, Officer Stanley, experienced his first real fear in years of service. He accidentally noticed that the face of the detainee on the surveillance monitor had distorted for a moment, not from emotion, not from pain. It was as if the signal itself had been distorted, as if the camera had shown something that shouldn't have been there. Two frames. One showed a calm man. The other showed a blurred figure with no facial features. A second later, everything was back to normal. He said nothing, but the tremor in his fingers gave him away in the observation room. Meanwhile, Jenkins, still unwilling to admit that the case was becoming irrational, attempted to insert fictitious data into the report. Boilerplate text used in bureaucratic paperwork. The system accepted it but deleted it a minute later. The file disappeared spontaneously, and a warning appeared on the screen. Unauthorized interference. Object outside jurisdiction. At that moment, something in the officers' minds began to shift. They did not discuss what was happening out loud. but each of them felt that this was not just a human being standing before them. And it wasn't paranoia or a belief in conspiracies. It was an instinctive feeling, an ancient fear of something that cannot be explained, but can be felt in the spine. Senior Officer McClansky, a rational man who had long since allowed himself no weaknesses, nevertheless went to the cell. He stood on the other side of the glass and watched the detainee. The man sat motionless. He did not raise his head. He did not look up. And yet McClansky felt as if his gaze was still touching him, piercing him. It was as if the man in the cell could see more than he was allowed to, more than anyone could bear. He wanted to open the door, but his hand wouldn't move. A strange feeling arose in his chest. Not fear, but something deeper, shame, as if he were standing before someone he had no right to touch. Not with the bars, not with the protocol, not with explanations. McClansky left without saying a word. He just glanced at the list of detainees where the empty line under number 17 flashed yellow. Awaiting confirmation of identity. Outside the station, dawn was breaking. The streets were still empty, but the city seemed to sense that someone was sitting inside the building who no one was supposed to see, no one was supposed to touch, and certainly no one was supposed to arrest. Code 379. By noon, the station began to resemble a pulsating vein. Every employee coming on duty instantly felt the distorted pressure of what was happening. It was a dull day. The sky was covered with a thick gray layer, and it seemed that the sun was not just hiding, but watching, from behind the clouds, silently, like a third witness in an interrogation. The detainee was still in the cell, no changes. He didn't get up, didn't lie down, didn't eat. A medical examination was scheduled but never took place. The orderly, having received the referral, entered the corridor twice and turned back both times. In his report, he wrote, "Refusal of medical intervention." It was a lie. He didn't even approach the door. The situation was heating up. McClansky and Jenkins, now barely speaking to each other, took turns reviewing the internal archives. Information related to the detainee continued to disappear. The recording from the car's camera disappeared from the system completely, without a trace, as if the file had never existed. The situation was similar with the street cameras. The metadata was there, but the video files were empty. It was as if someone had cut the man out of the digital fabric of the city. And then McClansky took the ultimate step. He activated an internal request using a special code. This code was rarely used, intended for emergency situations, and transmitted directly to the Special Threat Management Department, code 3-7-9. He knew that using this code would automatically be recorded at the federal level, but he had no choice. He felt that the usual police hierarchy was powerless here. The detainee didn't just not fit into the system. He was eating away at it, like acid poured onto the surface of the familiar world. 10 minutes after the code was activated, the station lost all access to federal databases. All computers went into offline mode. A brief message appeared on the monitors. Object registered. Responsible department notified. And in the system event log, someone noticed that the time of the last login was recorded not as the current day, but 2 days ahead, as if someone already knew that access would occur. And when exactly? This detail did not make it into any of the reports. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the building was getting tense. Several officers complained of headaches. The officer on duty at the 7th post started bleeding from his nose. The light in the corridor leading to the cell was flickering for no reason. No electrician had been called. Someone in the smoking room whispered that the building might be under surveillance, not by the police, and not by the authorities. At approximately 2:23 p.m., an unremarkable black SUV with no license plates arrived at the station. 2 men in dark suits got out. They did not show any documents, but were allowed in immediately after mentioning the call number, 379. They did not introduce themselves. Their voices were muffled and their behavior was mechanically restrained. They did not ask questions. They stated facts. Their visit was brief, lasting only 3 minutes. They approached the surveillance monitor, watched the detainee, wrote something down in a notebook, and before leaving, uttered a phrase that was not captured by any camera or microphone. However, Officer Stanley, who was standing nearby, heard it. "He's not here for us. We're here for him." 5 minutes after they left, the lights in the corridor went out completely. The camera showed a distorted image. The detainee was still sitting in the same position, but his shadow seemed to be moving separately from his body. One frame, one glitch. Then everything stabilized. McClansky ran his hand over his face as if trying to wipe away everything he had seen. He was no longer sure what had happened that night or what was happening now. His mind was still clinging to procedural frameworks, orders, and subordination, but everything in the station pointed to one thing. No procedure applied to the person currently in cell number. Their mistake was not that they had detained him without cause. It was that they thought they had the right to do so. White noise in the station. By evening, an oppressive silence had settled in the building, broken only by the faint hum of air conditioners, drops from a faulty tap, and the crunch of plastic coffee cups. But the most distinct sound was another. Quiet, electric, almost imperceptible. A noise that was impossible to explain. It didn't come from any device. It had no source. It just was, constantly, in the background. And anyone who was alone for even a minute began to hear it. The police station, an old and familiar building, suddenly began to feel like a living organism. Tired, locked up, trembling with internal tension. There were no criminals in it, except for one. But he had not been charged. He had not been registered. He had not even been named. He just sat in his cell like a stone in the center of a pond, sending out ripples of distortion into minds, feelings, and technology. The detainee did not move. His face remained calm. Time did not touch him. He did not age, did not tire, showed no curiosity or aggression. He just watched. It seemed that he did not need sleep, food, or water. One of the officers, Junior Constable Owen, noted that more than 18 hours had passed since the arrest, and the man had not drunk a drop. The report was not forwarded. Owen simply tore the page out of his notebook and burned it in the trash can. The office mail system froze. Incoming emails stopped coming in. The phones didn't ring. Even the emergency communication channels, which were always open, fell silent. Attempts to contact headquarters were met with the message, "Line unavailable. Please try again later." But later never came. McClansky locked himself in the archive room and tried to study the analog recordings. He found a tape with video surveillance of the outside entrance on the night of the arrest. It showed everything except the most important thing. The patrol car pulls up, the officers get out, and an empty street. Not a passerby, not a figure, just an empty sidewalk. They approach the void and, a few seconds later, return with the detainee. But he's not on the recording. He doesn't appear. It's as if the officers detained air, an empty space. He rewound it, checked the date, the time, the synchronization. Everything matched, but the figure of the man was not there. And the longer he stared at the screen, the more he felt a chill gathering behind him, unrelated to the temperature. Something was watching him, just like the detainee had watched through the glass of the camera. He turned off the monitor. Meanwhile, Jenkins sat in front of the mirror in the break room, staring at his own eyes and unable to understand why he didn't recognize himself. He tried to convince himself that it was just fatigue, just nervous tension, just a coincidence. And yet, deep down in that part of his mind where reason no longer had power, he knew, from the moment they had detained that man, They were no longer police officers. They had become something else. Observed. The first conflicts began at the station. One of the officers lashed out at the duty officer, claiming that he had replaced his access card. Another accused his partner of sabotage. People who had worked side by side for years could now not stay in the same room for more than 10 minutes. The enemies were not outside. The enemies were born inside. Unexpectedly, quickly, silently, the white noise grew louder. It couldn't be measured with instruments, but it burned the nerves like ultrasound. People began to scratch their temples, jerk their necks, and clench their teeth. The music from the dispatcher's phone was playing with interference, and the clocks on the wall began to lag by 6 minutes. Exactly the same for everyone. Even the wristwatches. And in the cell, the detainee still sat as if at the center of this destroyed balance. He did not look at the cameras. He did not look at the guards. It was as if he could see through the building. His calmness became unbearable, because it meant only one thing. He knew how it would end. And there was no victory in that calmness. There was no joy, only sadness, like someone who has witnessed the same fall more than once. Extra in the report. By the morning of the next day, the station had completely lost its rhythm. The usual processes, filling out reports, changing shifts, handing over cases, began to falter. Formally, everything was still working, but it was as if on autopilot. Officers began to notice that the clocks in different offices were showing different times. Case files disappeared, only to reappear in a different order. Letters marked sent were found unopened. Some seriously thought that the station, like the building itself, was living by its own rules. But that wasn't the main problem. The main problem was him, and how impossible it was to fit him into the structure. Officer Jenkins, unable to take it anymore, sat down at the old electronic report form and decided to finish the paperwork. He tried to create a fictitious report of a disturbance of public order. He substituted a random name. He made up a date of birth. He entered boilerplate phrases: suspect detained at the scene, offered passive resistance, transferred to cell number. Non-gum. The program accepted the form. The file was saved. For a second, it seemed that the system had given up. But a few minutes later, the file opened on its own. One by one, the lines began to disappear. First, the name, then the reason for the arrest, then Jenkins's signature. In the end, only one line remained on the screen. In bold, error. The object cannot be processed. McClansky tried a different approach. He decided to record the detention in a physical logbook, as they did in the old days. With a pen and paper, he opened the page listing the detainees for the past 24 hours and wrote everything down by hand. Signature, time, cell number, reason, disorderly conduct. When he later returned to the log, the line had disappeared. Right off the paper, no crossing out, no ink marks, as if the entry had never existed. The page was intact, not torn out, just blank, like new. He flipped through the other pages and noticed for the first time that many other entries had begun to disappear. People who had been arrested a month ago were disappearing from the logbook. Reports from a week ago were empty. McClansky stared at the paper in horror, realizing that the station was losing its very memory of itself. He didn't tell anyone about it. That same day, an order came from above. An impersonal letter on the general server. Complete the paperwork for case number 213-S. Submit the report by the end of the shift. No name, no instructions, no signatures. Case number 213-S was not listed in any archive. It had never been registered. No one remembered who had opened it or when, but McClansky understood. It was about him, about the man who had been in cell number 4. He and Jenkins tried to create the case. They opened an empty file. They attached a photo of a man taken by a surveillance camera. It looked normal until the file opened in the viewer. The image of the man was blurry, no clear contours. It was as if the lens couldn't capture his presence. The file was corrupted, and with it, 20 more random photos in the database, unrelated to him. Ordinary cases, ordinary faces, all distorted, all lost. Later, one of the officers walked past the information board where printouts of current wanted persons were hanging. He noticed that an extra sheet had appeared between 2 pages. On it was a photograph, blurred, a human silhouette, indistinct features, and a handwritten caption, "Untouchable. Do not file, do not forget." No one knew who had written it. 5 senior officers attended the spontaneously convened meeting. They were all in different states, some exhausted, some irritated, some frightened. They decided to postpone everything until morning. The morning seemed almost mystical. If they could live to see it, maybe everything would become clearer, or disappear. But it wasn't supposed to disappear. They were disappearing. Their control, their power, their belief that order could be restored by simply filling out the right form, signing the right document, and filing it away in a folder. The problem was not that the detainee did not fit into the report. The problem was that he himself was like a report, the last one, about them. The guest without a name. On the 3rd day of detention, it became clear that they were not dealing with a person in the legal sense. Not a violator, not a criminal, not a witness. Something else. Invited or appearing, but definitely not detained. He was no longer perceived as a figure in a cell. Rather, he was like an event happening to everyone in the building. It was as if the station itself had become his shell, and he was the core that day after day was destroying the very essence of police routine. Officer Jenkins began to talk to himself, at first quietly, in a whisper, then louder, as if he wanted to convince someone invisible that everything that was happening was just overload, stress, coincidence. But each of his explanations sounded less and less convincing, until one night he went out into the courtyard and tried to burn his holster. The smell of melting plastic spread through the ventilation system. Jenkins was taken off duty. The report said, "Temporary incapacity." Although everyone knew he was the first to start breaking down, McClansky held on. Outwardly, he was composed and cool, but inside he was like a house with the lights gradually going out. He looked at the camera less and less. Each glance became heavier than the last. Not out of fear, but out of shame. He didn't understand who he was ashamed of. Meanwhile, the city administration began receiving the first strange calls from residents of the neighborhood where the arrest had taken place. People complained of power outages, flickering lights, broken doorbells, and thermostats. But some mentioned something else. A black figure appearing at the entrances, standing in the shadows of the trees, looking into the windows on the 3rd floor. The surveillance cameras in these courtyards showed nothing, but the residents swore they had seen something. A local psychologist was called in urgently to assess the officer's condition. In his final report, he wrote a sentence that no one could decipher. "This figure is not disrupting order. It is recording it." He left that same evening and never answered his phone again. The cell where the detainee was being held remained untouched the entire time. Guard shifts took place without any personal contact. Food was brought in and taken away a few hours later, untouched. The bottle of water remained full. He did not touch the bed. He did not lie down. He did not speak. He did not call out. But he was there. Everyone who passed by the cell experienced different sensations. Some had joint pain. Some lost their coordination. One officer's eyes started bleeding for no apparent reason. He was taken to the hospital and did not return. On the 4th day, a request came to check the database of detainees. An inspector from the district center checked the lists and found that there was one more person than there should have been in the electronic systems. One extra. He double-checked manually. Physically, there were 5 cells. 4 were occupied. The 5th was occupied by the man in question. But in the documents, in all the databases, he was not listed. He was not registered, but he was accounted for. A line appeared in the database with no name, no date of birth, only the status inside, under observation. Who added the entry was not established. When was unknown. Who wrote the status was unknown. From that moment on, the officers stopped calling him a suspect. No one called him anything at all. They whispered about him, or didn't speak at all. He wasn't officially registered, but he was everywhere. At some point, McClansky realized that they were no longer guarding the detainee. They were in his presence. They were under observation. They were not the authorities, but objects of study. And then the first real violation occurred, not online, not in the mind, but in reality. A frame captured at night appeared on the surveillance cameras. The cell door was open. The detainee was standing in the corridor, but none of the guards noticed. Not a single motion sensor was triggered. He just stood there, looking toward the registration office. In the next frame, the camera was closed. He was back inside. Everything was as it had been, but no one could explain what he was looking for there, and most importantly, why he had returned. Cameras don't write. On the 5th day of the detainee's stay at the station, the last bastion of rationality disappeared. Video surveillance. It didn't turn off. It didn't break. It just stopped recording. The cameras continued to film. The indicator lights flashed, and the screens displayed images in real time. But when anyone tried to view, play back, rewind, or save the recording, the system returned nothing. Even the time codes were erased, as if they had never existed. Instead of video, there were black rectangles, or static, ominous freeze frames of empty corridors, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and everyone knew it. At first, they thought it was a local glitch they called a technician, but when he opened the server's internal log, he recoiled from the screen. The log entries had been deleted, not deleted, erased, as if someone had burned them from the inside, leaving no structure, no trace of access. The folder with the previous night's recordings was empty, but it took up 2.4 gigabytes on the disk. Emptiness with weight. Later, one of the officers tried to take a picture of the detainee on his personal smartphone. At first, everything worked. The image was clear, and even the autofocus worked. But when he reopened the file, the screen displayed an error. The video could not be played. He sent the file by email, but the recipient received a black screen. When he tried to edit it, the app froze. When he tried to delete it, the phone turned off and would not turn on again. It got worse. The shift logs began to malfunction. The start and end times of shifts were the same. Signatures were misplaced. The same officer was listed in 2 places at the same time. Some of the junior staff claimed that they had seen McClansky in the archive room before his shift, and that he was looking at a monitor that showed nothing but his own reflection. Doctors examining the officers began to note alarming abnormalities, sleep disturbances, short-term memory loss, heightened color perception, hallucinations. Several people's handwriting changed overnight. One of the officers on duty lost the print on his index finger. Everything that was supposed to record, confirm, and maintain order was subject to one scenario: memory loss. Systematic, persistent, total, and all this was only inside the station. Outside, everything remained the same. Streets, patrols, radios, everyday life. Only the station existed as a time capsule, cut off from the course of events. The detainee did not leave his cell. He sat as before, leaning forward slightly, his palms on his knees. His face did not change, but it seemed that he was aging in reverse. as if the lines of his face were being erased, as if he had become less distinguishable, or, on the contrary, too distinguishable, but only for those who saw more than they wanted to. One of the employees, a former veteran who had served in Iraq, couldn't take it anymore. He approached the cell, unable to contain the pressure building inside him, and shouted, asking who he was. There was no answer, but the next day the man quit his job, turned in his uniform, and disappeared. The report contained only 2 words: "He's watching." McClanky no longer tried to record what was happening. He sat in the interrogation room looking at old paper files, not for work, just to remind himself how everything used to be clear, event to fact to document to result. Now there was a gap between these steps. It was as if the very logic of the world had cracked. He tried again. He turned on the surveillance camera. The detainee was there, on the screen, in the same position. McClanky looked at him and suddenly realized that there was no date on the screen, no time, no mark confirming that the frame was recent. Maybe it had always been like this. Maybe he had never moved. And then, suddenly, the detainee slowly raised his eyes. McClanky quickly turned off the monitor, but he already knew it wasn't on the video. It was happening right now. A ring without a signal. The 8th day began without a signal, literally. Not a single cell phone in the building was connected to the network. The Wi-Fi had gone down at midnight, and no technician had been able to restart it. In a building where every corner had once been saturated with signals, there was now absolute silence. It was as if the entire radiosphere had been burned out. Radio stations emitted static, walkie-talkies were silent. Landline phones rang for a long time, but no connection was made. Even calls to emergency services were dropped. At first, the officers thought it was an attack, perhaps cyber sabotage, maybe even a local EMP strike. Someone in a panic remembered the accidentally activated code 379. But the equipment was intact. It just didn't work like it used to. It was as if the entire network life of the building had been ripped out. McClanky decided to resort to extreme measures, using the emergency satellite communication line, intended only for situations involving mass panic or biological attacks. This line was located in a sealed box in an old archive room. It hadn't been used for over 10 years. He found the box, entered the code, opened it. Inside was a dust-covered communications device. The key element was an old dynamic telephone with manual activation via a satellite channel. It worked autonomously, powered by a separate battery. McClanky connected the power, pressed the activation button. The device came to life. The indicator light flashed. A second, another, a signal. The connection initialization began. He selected an encrypted channel with central control, at a level above the local department. The one where the people who made decisions were, not the ones who carried them out. There was a click in the receiver. Someone answered. But the voice was strange. Even without noise, without the characteristic transmission of speech over the line. The voice did not ask any questions. It only stated facts. You are requesting permission, but you are already inside. McClanky froze. He didn't say a word. But the voice continued. The subject does not require communication. He already knows everything you would like to say. The device switched off. The indicator light went out. The fan inside jammed. A light smoke began to rise from the case. The call log was empty. From that moment on, no one tried to call or write again. The people in the station fell silent, not because they were ordered to, but out of an inner necessity. Words lost their meaning when everyone knew that any attempt to communicate would be perceived as a plea for help from those who were no longer listening, or who no longer existed. The detainee was still in the cell, but now every time someone passed by, people had the feeling that it was him who was waiting for a call. Not them, not the system, but him. as if the signal was supposed to come to him, and the delay was not their isolation but his pause. Late in the evening, dispatcher Thompson tried to call his wife. The phone rang, the signal went through. He heard a voice, a woman's voice, but it wasn't her voice. "Thompson, you know who he is. We all knew, but we forgot." The call was cut off. The system went offline. 10 minutes later, Thompson wrote a resignation letter and left the building. He didn't take his things with him. The officers did not discuss the incident. It was as if an unspoken code now dictated no talking about the calls. One of the junior sergeants passing by the camera caught a glimpse of an old push-button phone lying on the detainee's knee, the kind that no longer exists. The screen was dark, but the sergeant swore he heard a dial tone. When he turned around, the phone was gone. Protocol 27B. On the 9th day, the silence in the station ceased to be background noise. It became a structure into which everything was woven: movement, conversation, even actions. The officers no longer worked in the usual sense. They lived inside a state where everything that had once been an instrument of order had become a ritual of powerlessness. It was in this state that Dana Ellington, a junior analyst in the documentation department, first saw mention of Protocol 27B. She had come to replace a retiring archivist. She was quiet, methodical, and suspiciously calm. On her way to her desk, she froze twice as she passed camera number 4, not out of fear, more out of recognition. Late in the evening, while working on an archive reconciliation of cases from the past 5 years, she stumbled upon an unrecognized document. No title, no author, but with a registry number, 27B/access level, NA/section, extraordinary events. The file could not be opened by normal means. It did not even appear in a normal search. Dana found it only by manually searching through the system shadows of backup copies. Opening it, she found unformatted text written in a machine font, simple, dry, undated. Protocol 27. B category, observational phenomenon. Subject, human-like structure with no confirmed identity. Behavior, non-interference. Observation, prolonged presence. Recommendation, do not identify, do not detain, do not make contact. Consequences, loss of data, destabilization of the psycho-emotional environment, isolation of the system from the outside world. Special note, if the object enters an isolated facility, the structure of the facility adapts to its presence. Order disappears. Only a reflection remains. This was not the first mention. Below were incident codes: 1973, Montana, 1989, Belfast, 2002, Novosibirsk, 2011, São Paulo. Below, written by hand, as if added later, it cannot be named. The name will nullify the system. Dana didn't report the document to anyone. She printed it out on a dot matrix printer, hid a copy under the lining of her jacket, and turned off the computer. After that, no one saw her again. The cameras didn't capture the moment she left. Only an empty corridor and a chair slowly spinning from inertia. But the document remained. Someone found it a few hours later. A copy. Without the original file. Just paper. McClanky read it, not for the first time in recent days, for the first time accepting what was happening not as a glitch, not as an accident, but as a challenge. He remembered the moment when they first saw the figure on the side of the road, and he realized they hadn't arrested this man. They had called him. At first, he thought it was nonsense, that the document was fake, but further down the list of incidents, he saw a signature, abbreviated but recognizable. WD. Those were the initials of his former mentor, Walter Dunville, the same man who had retired after a nervous breakdown in 2003 and had never spoken since. McClanky drove to see him that same night. He found the old man in a nursing home outside the city limits. He didn't speak or move. But he reacted. When McClansky said, 27B, Walter's eyes filled with tears. He reached out his hand, and in his trembling palm, he held a leather bracelet. It was exactly the same as the one the detainee had been wearing. McClansky said nothing. He took the bracelet and left. In cell number 4, the suspect raised his head a second before he walked back into the building. He already knew. Secretaries from Washington. The 11th day began unexpectedly. At 6:42 a.m., a black car stopped in front of the main entrance to the station. 3 men in suits got out. No identification, no badges, no emotion. Their faces were unfamiliar to any of the employees, but no one asked a single question. Their appearance was unauthorized but accepted as inevitable. They did not show any documents at the entrance, but they mentioned a number. Case 27B, live observation, Washington, directive without date. They were let in immediately. They were not interested in reports. They did not demand any reports. They simply walked, slowly but confidently, down the corridor toward cell number 4. The silence in the building became deafening. All activity stopped. Even the coffee machine turned off without finishing its cycle. The clock on the wall froze at 6:43 a.m. When the men approached the cell door, no one stopped them. No one accompanied them. They already knew where he was. They knew how to get there. They knew everything that was inaccessible to others. They were accompanied not by authority, but by the authority of silence, the kind that requires no proof. The cell door was opened. For the first time in days, they went inside. The door closed automatically behind them. At that moment, the surveillance camera switched to error mode. The recording indicator went out. No recording was made. They were inside for exactly 6 minutes and 42 seconds. Exactly, no more, no less. No one knows what happened during that time. No one asked. Those who tried to approach the door stopped themselves. Some couldn't even remember why they had gone there. When the men came out, their faces were different, not distorted, empty. One of them could barely walk. The second kept his hand in his pocket, as if trying to hold something inside. The third was still smiling, but his smile was more like a mask than a reaction. They didn't exchange a word, not with the detainee, not with each other, not with the officers. On their way out, they left an envelope, sealed, no address, only a label, to be delivered only if the subject disappears. After they left, communication was not restored, but irreversible processes began to take place in the station. Files on computers began to be deleted without commands. Folders disappeared, not only those related to the detainee, all cases. The database was 47% empty. The history of the district seemed to be disappearing on its own. The photos on the walls turned yellow in a single day. Some faded. In a group photo of the station from 2006, the faces of 3 employees disappeared. Only the silhouettes of the background remained. McClansky returned to the cell. The detainee was sitting in the same position. Only now his face seemed familiar, too familiar, as if he were part of something McClansky had long forgotten or suppressed. The secretaries from Washington did not reappear. Their numbers were unavailable. 2 hours later, the VIN numbers had been scraped off the car they had arrived in, and the wheels had sunk into the ground as if into soft clay. Later, one of the officers noticed that the 3 men had not been registered in the visitor log. The camera at the entrance had not recorded them. The fingerprint scanner had not been activated. It was as if they had never been there. Only one document remained, the one in the envelope. No one had opened it, but on the 3rd night the paper inside began to move. There was no wind. No one had touched it. And on the outside someone had written in a new hand, "If you are reading this, you are already inside, just like us." He knew all about it by the 12th day of his detention. The very word detained had lost its meaning. No one at the station called him a suspect or even a person anymore. He wasn't in the database. He didn't have a file. He wasn't linked to any case. But everyone knew he was there. He had become part of the interior, like a battery, like the shadow of the bars on the floor, like the silence in the corridor, familiar, constant, threatening, not by his actions, but by the fact of his presence. That morning, McClancy found a piece of paper on his desk. He knew for sure it hadn't been there the day before. The page had been torn from an old-style police notebook, the kind they don't issue anymore. On it was a list, addresses, times, names. At the top was his own. Below was his ex-wife. Next was his daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to in 10 years. Then a name he hadn't heard since 1998, the guy he shot in the warehouse during a chase. Back then, it was pure self-defense. That's what the report said. That's what the court ruled. That's what he told himself. There was no signature or date at the bottom of the page. Just one sentence. You never forgot. You just didn't look. He didn't show the sheet to anyone. He folded it in half and put it in his breast pocket, as if trying to hide it could stop what had already begun. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread around the station. The detainee had started talking, not out loud, not directly, but through others. Sergeant Blake had a seizure. He began repeating other people's words aloud, names, dates, events. Officer Carter began drawing maps of the city on the wall, marking the houses where police mistakes had been made in the past. Wrongful arrests, abuse of authority, missing files. The dates matched the archives. No one could explain how he knew. The detainee did not move. He did not speak. He just sat there. But everyone who approached him began to hear a question in their head that no one wanted to hear. What does he know about me? And the longer a person stayed near him, the closer the answer became, not in words, in the form of memories that surfaced, details that everyone wanted to forget. A young intern passing by the camera suddenly stopped, as if struck in the chest. He froze, and an hour later wrote a letter of resignation with the words, "I am not who I wanted to be." The building reacted. The walls cracked. The lights flickered. The cameras caught shadows that did not belong to any body. The space seemed to contract around the figure in the center, like a black star pulling everything around it toward itself. McClancy couldn't take it anymore. He went into the room. For the first time in 12 days, he spoke. "Do you know who I am?" he asked quietly. The man did not raise his head, but the voice, not heard by the ears but felt inside, sounded. "I know who you were and who you were supposed to be, and who you decided not to be." McClancy froze. His breathing quickened. He didn't know why, but he felt that this was not an interrogation. It was a confession, and he was not the one receiving it. At that moment, a message came to the security console, an automatic notification of unusual activity. The cell had recorded a temperature spike of 11 degrees in 1 minute. The air conditioners were working properly. McClancy came out 7 minutes later. Silently, he sat down in the archive room. He took a folded piece of paper out of his inside pocket and began to write the second part, the answer. From whom? Unknown. To whom? Clear. The faceless symbol. By the evening of the 12th day, the station ceased to exist as an institution. It became a place, a point, a node on a map that no one held in their hands anymore. The light in the offices turned yellowish like street lamps that had outlived their usefulness. The papers crinkled at the slightest touch. The names on the employees' badges began to fade, as if they had been written in pencil and were now being erased with an eraser. Slowly, persistently, but irreversibly. First, the surnames disappeared from the database, then their photos, then their access rights. A day later, even the internal duty roster showed only empty lines. The officers were still working, walking around, talking, but they were nowhere to be found. Just like him, the face of the detainee, previously so clear as if cut out of the night with a knife, became undefined. It did not blur, it did not fade. It was simply no longer memorable. Someone tried to describe it. No one could. Everyone saw something different. One spoke of wrinkles. Another mentioned childlike smoothness. Some spoke of empty eyes, others of the warmest eyes they had ever seen. In photographs taken secretly or officially, the figure was there, but the face was not. A stain, emptiness, a glitch. The psychological team sent from the regional administration did not reach the station. Their navigator led them to a dead end. Literally, the road disappeared in the last few kilometers. The official car was found later in a field. The engine was running. There was no one inside. In the passenger compartment was a copy of Protocol 27B, written by hand, as if in a panic. The text was repetitive. He is not a human being. He is a system. Meanwhile, strange reports began to appear in the city media. At first, they were unremarkable notes: malfunction in the Southern Police District, technical work in the building on Selvers Street. But the journalists who wrote them soon deleted their accounts. One disappeared. The second was admitted to a psychiatric ward. The third burned his laptop and turned himself into the police station, silently walking into a storage room and locking himself inside. He didn't ask for anything. He just left a note under the door. "I just wanted to know the truth. Now I'm part of it." McClanky, observing what was happening, realized that the detainee was no longer a subject. He was a symbol, not a face, not a name, but a black hole that was sucking in everything that had ever been hidden in archives, in classified files, in lines added retroactively. He did not accuse. He showed, and everyone who entered the building recognized themselves in one way or another, some in their gestures, some in their silence, some in the fact that they could not forget even though they tried very hard. He was the justice system looking in the mirror, without makeup, without excuses. A symbol does not need a name. A symbol does not need a voice. A symbol does not leave until those who summoned it admit that they themselves are part of it. You did not arrest a man on the 13th day. He disappeared. He didn't escape. He didn't leave. He wasn't released. He simply disappeared. Cell number 4 was empty. The door was locked. The surveillance cameras were powered down. The alarm was silent. No sensors, no traces, no evidence. He did not leave the building. He was no longer there, and yet he remained. The feeling of his presence did not disappear. It grew stronger. In every office, in every corner, in every glance at each other. People no longer spoke. They felt. And they asked no questions, because they knew the answer had already been given. In the center of the duty room, right on the call panel, lay an envelope, the same one left by the people from Washington. Only now it was open, although no one had opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no stamps, no watermarks. On it, in uneven handwriting, was written, "You didn't arrest a man. You arrested a mirror," and it remembered everything. McClanky read it first. He sat in silence for a long time. He left the building. He got into his car, but he didn't drive away. He looked in the rearview mirror. He didn't see himself there. A day later, the station was closed. The official reason? Reorganization due to loss of administrative capacity. An official term for something no one could describe. All the documents were gone. All the employees were transferred, fired, or disappeared from the system. The building was sealed off. But overnight, someone wrote in chalk on the door, "I was here. I listened. Now it's your turn." And somewhere in another city, in another district, at night under a streetlight, a man is standing, tall, in a black jacket, calm. He's not doing anything, just standing there. A police car slows down. The officers look at him, and it seems to them that he will recognize them first.